Hello everybody. So I will continue now on the lecture about family and sexuality. In the last video we talked about the family, so now we're going to talk about sexuality and family partnering. And within sexuality we're going to discuss the three dimensions of sexuality and also look at some data from the 2006 and 2008 National Survey of Family Growth. And we also will see some other empirical analysis of sexuality in the US. So we'll just go into slide 37, because these previous ones we saw in the previous video. And so sexuality, here what we're going to discuss are these two different approaches to measure and to define sexuality. One is the essentialist approach, which is more based in biology, and the other one is the social constructionist approach. The essentialist approach is pretty much basing all the way that you measure sexuality of people is based pretty much on biological and psychological characteristics common to all persons and distinguish them as either of being of one sexuality or not. So it's pretty much using this dimorphism approach. And a fundamental drive for one's inclusion into or not into heterosexual or homosexual characteristic, it's all based on this biological characteristic that the person has, and also it's can be also related to psychological characteristics that the person has, but it's pretty much a binary approach that the person classifies as being heterosexual or homosexual. The social constructionist approach is against the notion of binary categories that this essentialist approach uses, and it proposes these varying degrees of sexuality. So Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues moved sexuality research away from this binary approach exactly to get these all different degrees of sexuality. And on this book, The Social Organization of Sexuality, Sexual Practice in the United States, from 1994, there is exactly a debate and more explanation about the need to have more fluidity on the explanation or understanding of sexual orientation among people. So the social constructionist approach pretty much tries to capture three different dimensions of sexuality. One is self-identification, the other sexual behavior, and the other sexual preference. Sexual identification is where the person classifies as being homosexual or heterosexual, so it's self-identification of sexuality. Sexual behavior is whether the person reports having had sex with another person of the same sex or different sex. And sexual preference is more related to desire, whether the person desires to have sex with a person from the same sex or different sex. All of the dimensions do not necessarily agree with each other, and someone who might answer one question that classifies the person as being homosexual in one of these three dimensions, in the other ones, the person might answer in a way that classifies as being heterosexual. So the dimensions do not necessarily agree with each other exactly to get more this fluidity approach of sexuality and the more the complexity of sexuality among people. So just looking at some data from 2006 and 2008 from the National Survey of Family Growth, and this survey collects really detailed data about sexuality among people, And so it's possible to measure exactly these three dimensions that we mentioned before about sexuality. And exactly because these questions are more intrusive for the people, because they have to answer questions that are really about their personal lives. The survey uses an audio computer assisted self-interviewing approach. So it's pretty much people answer the questions using the computer. So the data is more complete. So people tend to answer more questions, and also the data is more reliable. So there are questions related to self-identification. So they measure the self-identification dimension of sexuality, and also the behavioral dimension. In the behavioral dimension, people are classified as being heterosexual if they had heterosexuals are those having only opposite sex partners and no same-sex partners, and homosexuals are those having only same-sex partners and no opposite sex partners. So that's the behavior dimension. It's related to the action of having sex with either opposite sex partners or same-sex partners. So you classify them as being heterosexual or homosexual. In terms of sexual preference, it's related to the desire. So heterosexuals are those who are only attracted or who are mostly attracted to the opposite sex, and homosexuals are those who are only attracted or who are mostly attracted to the same sex. So that's more related to the desire dimensions, to sexual preference. So all these different questions are captured in the survey, and then they allow us to measure the three different dimensions of sexuality. And based on these questions here, we can have different outcomes from this data. So we can have a person who is classified as homosexual or heterosexual, and based only on identification. So that person might give a homosexual answer only to the identification question, or only to the desire question, or only to the behavior question. And exactly because, as I mentioned before, all these three different dimensions, they not necessarily the people will give all similar answers to those that you classify them always as being homosexual or heterosexual. So they can give a homosexual response only to each one of them, as well as a heterosexual response only to each one of them. And then you have all the different combinations. A heterosexual response to both identification and desire, or to both identification and behavior, to both desire and behavior, and a homosexual or heterosexual response to all the three dimensions. So just based on this data, and what it was found is that 2.43% of the females gave a homosexual response to at least one of the three dimensions. So they self-identify as homosexual, and or they had same-sex sex in their lifetimes, or they desired or have been attracted to same-sex persons. So 2.43% of females gave a homosexual response to at least one of the three. So identification, behavior, and desire. And just to give an idea of the sample size, this is 7,356 women interviewed, and 179 of them gave at least one homosexual response to within the three dimensions. For males, this percentage was 2.87, so a little higher than among females. And the sample size for males is a little smaller, 6,139, and 176 of these males answered at least one homosexual answer to at least one of these three dimensions. And among, so 17.62% of the female homosexual sample reported all three dimensions. So among this woman here, 179, only 17.6 of them reported all three dimensions. And among these men here, only 29%, almost 29% of them reported the three dimensions. So this is just to show that people might self-answer the questions that would classify them as being homosexuals if we think that they should answer all of those in order, as homosexual should be classified as homosexual, the numbers would be much smaller, because only like almost 18% of women out of this gave homosexual answers to all the three questions, and 29% among men. So just looking at this data in the graph format here, we have, these are for females, homosexual females that answered, that gave a homosexual answer to at least one of the questions. So 23% of them, it was only to behavior, 22 only to desire, 4.4 only to identity, and these are the combinations. So this number here, 17.62, if we go back to the previous slide, is exactly this number here. So this percentage of the female, 17.62% of the female homosexual sample reported all three dimensions. That's exactly this here, and this number appears as the intersection of the three dimensions: behavior, desire, and identity. And the highest percentage are those, like of 31.21%, are those who reported both being homosexuals in terms of the identity and desire dimensions. So if we were to say that only the ones that reported three dimensions as homosexuals to be classified as homosexuals, we would lose a lot of people. We would lose all these different people here that answered at least one of the other questions as being homosexual. And this 2.43 here, if you go back to the previous slide, is exactly this number. So this 2.43 is exactly all these women who gave homosexual response to at least one of the three dimensions. So that's the 179 women out of the total sample. So this is the graph for women. For men, as we saw in the previous slides, 2.87% of them, so it's related to the 176, report at least one of the three dimensions of being homosexual. So 287, go back 2 slides, it's exactly this number here. But out of this, only 2869 reported all three dimensions, and that's this number here. So this, only 28.69 out of these people here reported all three dimensions, and these people here are 2.87% of the total sample. And the highest percentage, as we saw also for women, are those who report both identity and desire as being homosexuals. It's 40.03 is here. So just based on this data, in comparing the essentialist versus the social constructionist approach, the essentialist approach actually works whenever we are trying to measure the response or the percentage of people in a specific population who are heterosexuals. So just to give an example, 71.54% of females and 79% of males are heterosexuals on all 3 questions. So it kind of like shows that actually this number is high for people who answer the heterosexual categories on all 3 questions, and kind of showing that the fluidity and among heterosexuals, it's not as pronounced as among homosexuals. But the essentialist approach does not work well for homosexuals. Homosexuality is much more fluid than heterosexuality. An essentialist interpretation places the percentage levels of homosexuality into much lower levels. If we wanted in the previous graph to say that homosexuals are only those who gave homosexual answers to all 3 questions, we would underestimate a lot the percentage of those who could be classified as homosexuals. So the social constructionist orientation provides a much more encompassing understanding of sexuality. So if we just go back to the graph, the point is that if we require that they give a homosexual answer to all the 3 different dimensions, we would be getting, here in the case of men, only 29% out of these people here would be classified as homosexual. So we would be underestimating a lot, because a lot of them are actually in these other groups here, either reporting 1 only dimension as homosexuals or 2 dimensions as homosexuals. Not this one, not the identity and behavior, there was no case, but for identity and desire, that's really high, and also only desire and only behavior, they also have higher percentages. Identity is kind of lower here. So, and just going further on this analysis, doing some more data analysis in terms of the prevalence rates in the US, exactly trying to understand whether people are giving answers to all 3 dimensions or to only one of them. So first, in terms of heterosexuality, among females, 95.43% of women aged 15 to 44 gave a heterosexual answer to at least 1 dimension. And 71.54% gave heterosexual response to all 3 dimensions. So, I mean, we still lose people here, dropping from 95 to 71, but at least these numbers are kind of high numbers and give us a good understanding of the percentage of females who are heterosexuals in the US. And for males, 95.77% of them reported at least 1 dimension of being heterosexual, and 79% responded all 3 dimensions of being heterosexual. Again, it drops, but still 80 and 95, we have a good idea of the percentage of males who are heterosexuals in the US based on data between 2006 and 2008. When we go into those classified as homosexuals, among female, 1.86% of them gave a homosexual answer to at least 1 dimension, but only 0.33% of them gave a homosexual response to all 3 questions. So if we require that they give a homosexual response to all 3 questions in order to classify them as homosexuals, we would be dropping from 186 to 0.33%. I mean, in terms of the difference here of like around 1.5% is not as high, it's lower than here, but in magnitude, like in proportion, you would lose a lot of information of people who, of women who we would classify as being homosexuals or not. And among men, this percentage would drop from 2.24 among those who have an answer, a homosexual answer to at least 1 dimension, and 0.33 64%, only 0.64% of them gave a homosexual response to all questions. So all these numbers here are represented in the next table. Just to show you here, this is in terms of heterosexuality. So 95.43% of women reported at least one of the categories as being heterosexual, so 95.43. Go back to the slide, 95.43, and 71.54 gave heterosexual response to all three questions. So this 71.54 is right here, to all three questions. And for men, 95.77 to at least one of the questions, and back to the previous slide, 79.09 to the three dimensions. So these numbers here kind of give us an idea that heterosexuality among men and women is high in the US in these years. And then when we see the table, this is the table for heterosexuality, the next one for homosexuality, we see, as we mentioned before, 1.86% of women, they give a homosexual answer to at least one of the dimensions. Among men, 2.24% give a homosexual response to at least one of the dimensions. And if we go and look at those women who gave a homosexual response in all three dimensions, then we would drop from 1.86 to 0.33. And for men, 2.24 to 0.64%. So here we gave some data about some main concepts about the essentialist and the social constructionist approach of sexuality, and also gave you some idea of the major percentage of people classified as homosexuals or heterosexuals in the US using all these different approaches. And the next topic about family partnering, it's important for us to understand the different family partnerings that are possible to have in our societies. Like these are, it's a way to classify them in these four types. The first type would be a married or cohabiting male and male. So we would have gay partners here in this first category. Another type of family partnering, a married or cohabiting female and female. So they would be lesbian partners. And another type of family partnering, two persons living together as a married male and female. So here we would have opposite sex married partners. And a fourth type, a cohabiting male and female. So they would be classified as opposite sex cohabiting partners. So among gay partners and lesbian partners, we are pretty much grouping married and cohabiting partners. And here among lesbian partners, the same thing. We are grouping married and cohabiting. Among opposite sex, we are disaggregating between married and cohabiting, exactly because there is a higher percentage of those people, so we have a higher sample size whenever we collect data from surveys. How exactly you get data to classify these households by these types of family partnering? The census, the demographic census in the US, the decennial census, has a question that allows us understand whether that person is the husband or wife of the person one of the household. So here we have a portion of the answers that the second person on the household is giving. So the second person answers, how is this person here related to the person one in the household? So this person, if he or she says that that person is the husband or wife of person one, So we know that that person is married to person one. Or that person can also say that's an unmarried partner, so we know that person is cohabiting with person one. So here we have married couples, and here we have cohabiting couples. And so that's how you can measure the married and the cohabiting partners in a specific society. In this case here, using in data from the US. We are talking specifically about the American society. And then you also have the sex of, in this case we are asking the sex of person 2, and then you can compare with the sex of person 1, so we know whether both are male, or whether both are female, or whether one is male and the other one is female. So based on the answers of question 2 from person 2 and from question 3 from both person 1 and 2, we are able, going back to the slide, classify the households by these 4 types of family partnering. So that's how the information is collected from the demographic census in the US. So just analyzing, like this study by Poston and Shang, they analyzed 366 metropolitan areas in the US to estimate the prevalence indexes for each type of family partnering. And so there are different studies that were doing that, and these prevalence indexes, they are pretty much the ratio of the proportion of each type living in a metropolitan area to the proportion of all households that are located in that specific metropolitan area. So they pretty much measure over representation or under representation of each type of family partnering in a geographic area relative to the whole population, because you are getting the proportion of each type of family partnering living in a specific metropolitan area and dividing by the proportion of all households in that area. So whenever we get these ratios, the way to interpret them, you have just to if you have an index equals to 1, it means that that family partnering type is as likely as randomly selected household to locate in the partner type is as likely as a randomly selected household to locate in that metropolitan area. So if the ratio equals to 1, so that specific family partnering type, it's pretty much, we can find that family partnering type anywhere in all those analyzed metropolitan areas. If the index is above 1, that specific family partnering type is more likely to live in the metropolitan area than a random couple household. So, and if the index is below 1, the family partnering type is less likely to live in the metropolitan area than a random couple household. And an easy way to interpret these ratios is just to do a percentage interpretation. So you just get the index, subtract by 1, and then multiply by 100. So just to give you some examples of the findings that these researchers got, the prevalence ratio index for gay partners equaled 0.69. So exactly that, doing 0.69 minus 1 multiplied by 100, we get minus 31%. So what does that minus 31% mean? In the average metropolitan area, gay couples are 31% less likely to live there than would be a couple from a randomly selected metropolitan household. So that means that gay couples, they are more concentrated in specific areas than a randomly selected couple from the metropolitan from a metropolitan household. The ratio for lesbian partners equals 0.86. So 0.86 minus 1 times 100% equals minus 14%. So that means that in the average metropolitan area, lesbian partners or lesbian couples are 14% less likely to live in that metropolitan area than would be a couple from a randomly selected metropolitan household. So these magnitudes are kind of strong, 31%, 14%. They are far away from zero. And in the case of the opposite sex married partners, the ratio equals 1.02. So 1.02 minus 1 times 100%, we have 2%. So in the average metropolitan area, opposite sex married partners are 2% more likely to live there than would be a couple from a randomly selected metropolitan household. So 2% is not really strong in magnitude. And the same thing happens for opposite sex cohabiting partners. They are 3% more likely to live in that metropolitan area than a randomly selected, than would be a couple from a randomly selected metropolitan household. So these percentages here for opposite sex partners is pretty much showing that opposite sex partners, both married or cohabiting partners, they're kind of like evenly distributed across these metropolitan areas. So that's why this magnitude here is so small. But for gay partners and for lesbian partners, they are more concentrated. So that's why you get this higher magnitude. So these numbers here, they are showing exactly in this table. So if you just go to the previous slide, the ratios here, 69, 86, 1.02, 1.03 are exactly these numbers here. But what we also see in terms of the variation of this overall mean, this overall average, is that the index of the gay male couples varies much more, as well as the lesbian couples index. They vary much more than the indices from opposite sex couples. And this study makes an even further contribution by looking at these specific indices for specific regions. So they find here, for example, the index for gay male couples is 2.78 in San Francisco, California. So these gay male couples, they are 2.78 times more likely to live in this metropolitan area than a couple from a randomly selected metropolitan area. So they are really concentrated in this specific region, and they are the chance of finding them in Grand Forks is really low, because this number is much lower than 1. And for lesbian couples, higher chances to find them in Ithaca, 2.97 times more likely to find them there than would be a couple from a randomly selected metropolitan household, and much less likely to find them in this specific location. And when you see for opposite sex couples, what you see, the maximum and the minimum values, we see some variation, but they are much closer to one unit than this case is here. This number is much higher than 1 than this one here, and this number here is much lower than 1 than this number here. So you see much more concentration of gay male couples and lesbian couples in specific areas in the country than opposite sex couples, both married and cohabiting. So in terms of geographic composition, what we saw is that same-sex couples have uneven distribution in the US. Gay male couples are much more likely to be in some areas than in other areas. Lesbian couples are more concentrated in metropolitan areas in general than gay male couples, but they don't prefer particular cities as gay men. Opposite sex couples are the majority of couples in any metropolitan area. They are just about as likely to live in any of the areas. That's why the ratio was really close to 1. Especially married couples, the minimum and maximum values are closer to 1. If you go back to the previous slide, is exactly this one here. These numbers here are really close to 1, even closer to 1 than in the case of cohabiting couples, opposite sex cohabiting couples. And then finally, just this data from the general social survey in terms of the support of same-sex marriage by age. And this is data from 1990 to 2020. What we see is that the support of same-sex marriage by age in the US, and the people who answer this survey are adult respondents, so people with at least 18 years of age. So the support has been increasing over time overall, but you see that younger people, those in this case here between 18 and 34 years of age, they have even higher percentage of support of same-sex marriage in the country. And older people, in this case here, 65 plus, their support to same-sex marriage has been increasing over time, but it's still lower than for other younger groups, right? So the support has been increasing over time, but there is a clear differential by age. So these are the references that we used for this lecture. These two papers that I showed before here to give some examples of more recent analysis, and these two textbooks were also used for our analysis. So that's it. Thank you very much.